Too
Welcome to the sixth annual VChai Virtual Coffee Hacktoberfest initiative. And the first year that we did this was during the pandemic. And this is when we were just a fledgling little community. We didn't know that we were going to be around this long. We thought, well, I thought it was just going to be people chatting during the pandemic. Still going on, still doing this. It's great to see everybody here today. And so for us, this event has always been a really special moment where we can support each other, help each other through Hacktoberfest, see people get into open source, see maintainers grow their projects. And so we always do something where we introduce you to open source so people at any level can share. If anybody wants to help or support or mentor, feel free to add that in the chat. We'll walk you through our virtual coffee repository and how to contribute to that. And there is an issue every year for folks to complete their first pull request. So hopefully by the end of today, you will get your first pull request. And if not, if you need some help or if you have questions afterwards, feel free to hit any of us up. Or you can add your questions to the monthly challenge channel. We also have an open source channel that kind of runs year round, but just for simplicity, if you have Hacktoberfest questions, there are folks that are active in that, actively watching that channel to make sure that we can help and support you. So that's the overview. And now I'm going to send it back to Dan.
Thanks, Becca. Um, Welcome everybody. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we're going to kind of do the same thing we've done in the past, where there are a lot of ways to make changes to repositories, things like that. The one that is the most simple is to do this straight in the GitHub UI, which doesn't sound super exciting, but it is, I promise, totally valid. And it's the easiest way to get kind of straightforward, get going, with changes to repositories. This is especially true, I find, if you're doing content changes, things like that, where you don't necessarily need to pull down the entire repository and get everything loading. After I go through this, and maybe after the recording's done, we can hang out. And if people want to try to get their local environment set up, I'd be happy to, um, you know, go through that with everybody as well. If you are following at home, I'm going to start sharing here in a second. I'm just getting my Windows set up. But if you are following at home and you are doing it locally, make sure to pull down the latest from main before you start doing any changes, because the changes from main have the latest stuff that we'll need for our new adventure. So let me get going here. All right, so share,
Hey
share.
Dan,
What up?
I put the link to our repository in the chat there, so everybody knows.
Sweet.
Also,
Thank
should
you.
people jump in with questions throughout if they
Yeah.
have them?
Yeah, I'm a little out of practice at like looking for raise hands and stuff, but you can try the raise hand if people want to just jump in. Meg and Becca have no problem interrupting me at any time. So,
We have
that's
zero
that's
problem with that.
I also have zero problem with it. So that's still true too. I would say if anybody has questions, whatever, just feel free to jump in at any time. This is not a scripted thing. You won't bother me.
And if
You might,
you
get me
are
off
shy
topic, but
about talking, um, where your voice will be recorded, you can also put your question in chat and we will
a
say, we have an
thousand,
audience member with a question
a
and read it
thousand
for
percent.
you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Meg. Yeah. And again, if people want to keep an eye on that, I will, try to pay attention to it as well. Okay, so first up, I would say is go to hacktoberfest.com. So this is not a required thing at all, but obviously the way that we started, Hacktoberfest has been going on for a while. It's now run by these kind of groups, DigitalOcean, things like that. But it is, like Becca said, a cool celebration of open source. And if you would like to participate in their thing, we're not affiliated with them at all, but you can kind of try to get your Hacktoberfest, checks in there. They are looking for six, right? Six pull requests this year, instead of whatever it was. Was it four or five before? Four. Yeah, that's what I thought. It was four. So they went up to six, which is cool. So, raising the bar a little bit.
They
Um,
brought back the t-shirts, so they
and they
have
brought,
up the game.
that's right. They brought back the t-shirts. It's pretty cool. So, again, we're not checking into this stuff, but I just wanted to throw the reminder out there. Um, okay, so um, the challenge this year is not challenge. The issue this year is similar to last year. We have this really cool members page. And so the one thing we're doing every year is adding the Hacktoberfest badge. So there's a new one this year. I'll go through all this, but I just kind of wanted to show y'all how it looks. We There's a Hacktoberfest 2025 badge. And then we are also adding, was it Joe's idea or was it Meg's idea? I'm not sure. But we had
Alex's idea.
what's that?
Alex Curtis
Oh, it was
Sled.
Alex. Nice. Sorry. Yeah. Um, to add you like your favorite emoji or whatever, or you can just whatever emoji you feel like adding at the time. We might eventually do something fancy with it. Right now, if you add an emoji, it just kind of shows up before your name in the profile. So we'll see all that stuff here in a second. Joe is going to accept credits for all ideas. That sounds right. So that's our task for today. Again, it's pretty simple, and it's simple enough that you can, like I said, do this just on the GitHub UI. We have our site hosted on Netlify, and cool thing about that is if you make a pull request, it will build on Netlify servers, and you can look at a preview of the of your changes, right there. So again, you don't need the site pulled down locally to check this out. So you can see the preview and make sure you didn't make any mistakes or make sure it looks good. And yeah. So, any questions or thoughts, comments, concerns before I kind of jump into the issue itself? Um, if not, I will kind of get rolling here. So this is the issue. I will put the link if, oh no, you already did it. I'm sorry. Meg posted the actual issue up here, a little bit higher. Um, oh yeah, sorry, Meg. And then yeah, if you want to participate in Virtual Coffee, Hacktoberfest, we're kind of slimming the things down that we're doing a little bit, and so there's a cool Google form there. And again, that kind of gets you on our participation list and things like that. Um, okay, so this is the issue. So if you've done this previously, it looks very similar, and if not, that's fine too. So this says things to do about number 13. So issue 13 is our like adding the profile to our members page. So the way that this looks in the repository is we have, this is all the kind of the code and documentation that runs the site. And inside one of these folders is our members directory. Well, no, that's not it. Dan, where are you going here? It is inside somewhere. Where is it?
Dan, where are you going?
Where are you going?
Come on,
Daniel S.
Dan.
Pumpkins today. It's in content. Sorry, guys. I got it.
David
It's
with
in,
Pumpkins isn't as great of a coder as
I
Dan.
know, I know. Well, he spilled coffee all over himself. It's a whole thing.
The coffee only
Um,
goes in the mouth. It's not
w-
as effective on the pants.
exactly. I mean, it's probably good because I've had probably way too much coffee anyway, but it is what it is. So issue 13 is adding your profile. So this is like the base thing. So if you have not done this before, you want to start here and then you can apply the things that are in the new issue, right? So this is like the base level thing. And then after that, it's the new changes for this year. So if you were wanting to do that, inside, basically what you do is add a new file to this members directory. Um, I'll copy the URL just for this as well. So I just put that in the chat. And then if you haven't done this yet, there is an example file in here. It's like underscore example. And this is everything you need, everything you possibly can do with this file. So you can, copy the contents of this into a new file with your, I usually do your GitHub username. It doesn't actually matter too much what the name of the file is, as long as it's something, but it'd be cool if it was meaningful and, something about either your GitHub username or your regular name, whatever you want. And then there's instructions for, you have to like the only required thing in here is your actual GitHub username in this file. And then below that is all of the stuff that you can do. So also if you added your member file a long time ago and, have missed some of the recent changes, you can come in here and, copy and paste little chunks that you don't have, if you'd like. The newest thing here is the emoji thing. So we added that. We'll take a look at it later, but this is in the example file as well. So if you've started from scratch, you can go there. If you are not starting from scratch and you have a member file, then that's the kind of the path I'm going to follow. I'm gonna assume you're working with one file. So we can pull up this is my file. And you can see I have my username. And a bunch of different things that I've done through the years. Um, the badges, I actually noticed earlier that I don't have my the 2024 badge in here, so I'm going to add that while I'm going for it. All right, let's see. I probably should log into GitHub somehow. Is anybody gonna? So the problem with logging into GitHub is the view you see as a maintainer is slightly different than the view you see as a contributor. I have, you know what? I think I have a user I can use. Let me find this. See if I still have it. Oh yeah. All right. Let me go find the password for this one. I think I made a fake user for this a while ago, and um, all right, come on, computer. Yeah, let's see if this login still works. Ugh, no,
Dan, did you say we're using the GitHub CLI for this walkthrough?
not the CLI, the UI, like the
Oh, okay.
yeah, just like the web interface for the walkthrough. Um, the everybody kind of interacts with Git and everything a little bit differently. So it's it can get I've got every time I do this, I think about, oh, which way should we go, or should we do command line and straight in Git, and I end up, I don't know. This is one everyone can do, no matter what their thing is. All right, cool. I'm logged in now. However, I don't think that it would. Well, I could just do mine. Why not? Right? Even though I am not the original, I'm not logged in as the original member. That's fine. Oh, no, that's it. All right, so find your user or create that file, create a new file inside members with your username and copy the contents from the example in there. But once you have that, once you're looking at it in here, you can just hit edit in here. And so this is really cool. So what you'll do here is, and they're pretty good about explaining it, but if I was logged in as a maintainer, I can do edits straight in this thing, and it'll ask me later what I want to do. When you're a contributor that doesn't have right access to the repository, which is like most of the time if you're doing open source contributions, um, it just defaults to creating a fork and then setting it up on your your profiles thing, your profiles repository. It'll create a fork of this repository and then put you in a good place to create a pull request moving forward. So they do some cool things for you behind the scenes, which is pretty neat. So the badges is the first and most simple one. So for you all, Hacktoberfest. You want to add Hacktoberfest 2025. I am, while I'm in here, going to add Hacktoberfest 2024 since I participated then as well. So if you know you participated, you can add that. If you don't or you're not sure or whatever, just add the new one, then that's cool. We're going to take a quick peek at these. So it'd be cool if, nobody's trying to do anything sneaky. Um, so that's the first change, right? Is assuming you have the badges array, add hecto this string, and it's exactly the same as the other ones except for 2025. If you don't have this badges array or if it's commented out, make sure you uncomment it. And that should be it for that part. And then the next thing is to add the emoji. So one benefit of having it pulled down is you would get TypeScript, autocomplete, things like that, which you don't get in the UI. Um, But I can just tell you right now that it's just called emoji. And you want to make sure when you're doing this, it's like, again, this is like, I guess one of the downsides of doing code in the UI is you don't get a lot of the fancy tools that VS Code gives you. I know I could probably open this up in, what do they call it? Their code thingy, but I haven't done that for a long time. Last time I tried to do it, my computer tried to explode. So I'm going to just do it right in here. And then so the emoji is a string, and then you can just pick your favorite emoji. We're not doing any checking right now on like any mechanical checking on the contents of this. So please just, please just put one emoji in. I think right now if you put a whole bunch in, it would be fine as long as it was a string, but we will probably request changes if you do that.
Yeah, this goes through a review.
Yes, that's right. Um, we can probably walk through what that looks like from the maintainer side in a little bit, but we will we will review it with our eyeballs. But there's no like type checking, and that might be a kind of a cool feature to ask somebody to do as well. But that's not like that wouldn't be per person. That would just be type checking either type checking or you know checking it when we output to make sure we're in the emoji Unicode range with our eyeballs. That's right. So this is it. So I've added my emoji and I've added my badge, and I think that should be pretty good. So I'm going to hit commit changes. Um, Commit message. It'll just GitHub will auto fill this in. This is probably good enough. If you want to add an extended description, you can say added 2025 badge and emoji to my profile. Right? And so when I hit propose changes, what this does is forks virtual coffee, if you haven't already, and then sets you up to creating a pull request across the repository. So I'm like logged into this fake user. So it's saying that it says Dan uses GitHub is that GitHub user / virtual coffee, right? And the base repository is virtualcoffee.io, which is our main, where we want the base to be main, right? Uh, Occasionally, there's some situations where like you wouldn't want that, but I think in those situations, the maintainers, or the contributing guide, or the issue itself would specify that. Um, but this looks right to me. So here's my pull request description. Um, and we have a pull request template in Virtual Coffee. So not everybody does, but lots of people do. And we add some instructions to say, hey, can you do, can you give us some more comments? With this issue, we know mostly what's going on, but it'll be good practice to at least, add a little bit of detail. So when you get to this pull request linked issue, we want you to link directly to this issue. Um, we, I would ask you, please don't put the closes keyword in or anything like that for this one, because many people will be doing this one issue, right? But and there's, if the pull request did apply to just one issue and you knew that this pull request satisfies that issue, you can add that. So it would look like this, closes like that. You can add this keyword, and if you do that, and the maintainers, approve it and merge the pull request, it'll automatically close the issue, which is pretty handy. But in this case, please don't, because we want that issue to stay open all month. And then description, you can keep this pretty simple here. This is, well, I put it here. So it dumped in that extended comment that I did in the commit message, which is kind of cool. Methodology, again, this is like if this was an involved pull request, we'd want to see some stuff. Followed instructions in issue is good enough for here. And this is just our code of conduct notice. You don't have to do anything with it, but obviously check it out if you haven't before. And then yeah, this allow edits by maintainers box is almost, I think, pre-checked almost all the time. Yeah, there's I'm sure I could drum up some reason to uncheck that, but please like do all of your maintainers a favor and just like always leave that box checked, unless there's some specific. I don't know. If you have thoughts about why you would want to do that, drop them in the comments because I'm interested to know. But in general, this lets us go in and if there's and again, not wouldn't really apply to this issue, but for more complex ones, sometimes there's some small tweak, and yeah, I could request changes, but you know, it's sometimes just easier to do the change myself and get the pull request merged in. So that's pretty much it. And so what this is going to do is send the virtual coffee maintainers a notice and show up in the pull request page when I hit create pull request. The GitHub UI has this create draft pull request option too, which is kind of cool. If you have like a concept or you're not sure about, it's not like ready to merge, but you want some people to see it and review it. The draft pull request feature is pretty neat. But again, for this issue, we don't probably need any of that, and we can just hit create pull request.
Can we
And
just
that's it.
pause for a second, Dan?
Yeah, I was going to pause
Because
right
there's
there.
a lot of information there is great. So I want to make sure that folks have a chance to ask questions. So basically, you want to start by creating a fork of the repository, right?
Yeah, so if you're doing it through the UI, it does it for you, um, which is pretty dope. If you are doing it by checking code out on your own side and things like that, then you would want to do that, yes.
And then you go through and you make the changes. You create the PR, and we have a PR template there. And those are the different things that Dan walked you through how to fill in. And then you create that the pull request. So I know, especially for folks who are new to open source, there's a lot of maybe new vocabulary there, and sometimes that can feel overwhelming. We do have a guide on Virtual Coffee's website about open source, so this can be a good place to get started. If you have questions, always ask. But I also want to make sure that you had access to this. Oh, Dan is quicker than I am. So there is that. So you can check that out. If you have questions, again, I think it's normal to feel overwhelmed if you're not used to that vocabulary. Like, what is a fork? What does that mean? What is cloning a repository? What is an issue? Why do we have to have an issue? Why do we have to have a pull request? And I think, it kind of boils down to this idea of if everybody was working on the project at the same time and we weren't communicating in the same ways, it would get really complicated and confusing really quickly, and you might be writing on top of each other. And so, walking through the steps of open source helps the maintainers, who are the ones that control the repository, to be able to make sure that everything is working properly, that everybody's kind of taking their turns where they need to be, and that when that pull request or PR is merged in, it doesn't create any conflicts or break the site or whatever you're doing. So lots of different steps there. It's nice. I feel like GitHub has been making things easier since the first time we did Hacktoberfest. Um, but it's okay if it's confusing or if you have questions. So feel free to ask those questions or to ask us to repeat, or like, what the heck is that word that you just said and what does that mean? That's totally valid.
Yes, thank you, Becca. 1,000% agree. Um, That being said, does anybody have any questions at this time or anything like that? This is a good place to pause because we just finished the first step. Um,
I
and
actually have a
yeah,
question. So I'm not actually doing Hacktoberfest this year because I don't have time, but I would like actually to update my profile on the virtual coffee website because my location pin is in the wrong place now. So am I free to put in a pull request during October, even if I'm not doing Hacktoberfest?
yes, thank you. It's a good question. Absolutely, absolutely. That is always okay. Pull requests are always okay.
And I
Uh,
include an emoji on it.
sure, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's kind of one of the, and we should probably. I wonder if there's not a place to put that, like answers to that question. Like if your information changes at any time, yeah, we would want you to put a pull request in because we want the members page to be accurate as well, right?
Yeah,
And
I've been meaning to
yeah,
do it for a while. I just haven't got round to it. And
yeah,
October has suddenly started.
sure, sure. Yeah, so that once that member file is in there, it's I mean, we're not going to go around and try to check it or anything like that, after it's merged. So if you want to change any of those files, or I mean, any of those details at any time, yeah, a pull request is a great place to do it. I would say, and this is kind of specific to virtual coffee, but in those cases, I don't even think you don't need to make an issue for it. Just kind of note what you're doing in the pull request, updating Dominic's profile, and that is 1,000% good. Kind of note what you changed, and we'll see it in the pull request. Um, but but yeah, that's kind of the idea is like, yeah, as we move around or, you want to pick a different emoji next month or, anything like that, you have a new website, any of that stuff. Go for it for sure. Thank you, Dominic.
Um,
Yeah, go
also,
ahead.
when you are finished with this demonstration, I'd like to say a few words about um, some low code or no code contributions as well. So stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Um, so yeah, so we made our pull request. So now if you go to, the virtual coffees repository in GitHub and you go to pull requests, you'll see my pull request that I just made. And so I made this from the non-maintainer account. And so if you look at it from that view, should be what you see. So you can see here it's building on Netlify, which is really cool. So once this is done building, you'll be able to go and look at the deploy preview. This says merging is blocked. So this, like, I kind of wish they would make this look a little bit nicer. But what that means, and it says it here, but like the maintainers basically have a review process, so one of us can go and say approved, and then we can merge it, right? So that's the story there. So that's the only reason why merging is blocked. And you'll see that I see that on any of my pull requests. It's just kind of an automatic thing. And so this is a comment from Netlify. You can see it's processing, and this is the content that I added when I submitted the pull request. If you go into files changed, you can see the files that were changed. And so yeah, so this is actually an interesting little thing. We have a GitHub action that goes and applies a code formatter called Prettier to any pull requests. And it's again a thing that is nice to have. It's a thing that if you have this set up on VS Code or you have it set up locally, there's a good chance it'll just run when you hit save or things like that. But we can't, you know, I don't know. I'm not gonna say can't, but like we don't really like to like enforce that on that side, on the commit side. But when you push it up, GitHub will go run a little action that runs the formatting and then commit to it. So this says prettified code. So this is the output of our GitHub action. So that wasn't me in the UI. This is something that happened automatically behind the scenes. So I think this will only show up if Prettier needed to make changes, but you can see here, this is the change it made. It just broke this up instead of one line into, well, I guess 6 lines. So that's why it's 2 commits instead of just one. but it's still just one file changed, and I can see my changes here. If we were doing reviews or commenting, there's actually some pretty cool stuff. Or honestly, even if you had a pull request that you submitted, and then again, this is not necessarily for this issue, but if you were submitting to, like, submitting a larger chunk of change and you wanted to, I don't know, point out something that you did, maybe ask a question about, like, hey, do you think this implementation is okay? Or, I wasn't really sure what to put here. The pull request view. So this is when you go to the pull request, you land on the conversation tab. And you can always just paste in comments, just like on issues. But if you go to the top and go to files changed, you can add comments basically in line in the issue. So you can do like a one-line one, or if you see that, I hope you guys can see this plus button showing up, but if you do that and drag, then you can highlight an entire, section. And then you can add a like one line better, sad face. And you can say start a review, or you can just add a single comment, which is kind of what I was thinking. Most of the time, pull request reviews are done by maintainers or contributors that have, been longer term contributors. But I think technically anybody that is logged in can review a pull request. So you could do that if you wanted. But you can always add a comment. And so this will show up here on the file view, but now this comment also shows up here in the conversation, with the piece of code that you highlighted kind of injected in there. So it's a pretty cool little feature that I use a ton, both in open source and in work. The being able to, just kind of point to one section in your pull request. And yeah, I think that's, so are there any other questions as far as, I don't know, any of the stuff that I've covered so far? I was going to kind of show you what it looks like from the maintainer side next. But at this point, if you've gotten this far, your work is pretty much done, and now it's in the maintainer's hands to review it and merge it or request changes, things like that. So that's kind of what I was going to do next, if that's okay with everybody else. So now this is me logged in
I'll allow
as
it.
myself. What's up?
I said I'll allow it.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Could you show this code suggestion?
Yeah, sure. So
Yeah.
that is also a cool feature. So
I like that one a lot.
I do too.
I
I do
think
too.
I think some people don't realize how easy it is. Like
Yeah.
when they received a code suggestion, I don't think they realize there's like the one click
Yeah.
accept. So
Um, uh, pumpkin. All right. So I just typed in a comment, and then so this was, I hit the blue plus button again, and there in their UI is this plus minus button that says add a suggestion. And what it'll do is say suggestion, and it'll drop in the code that you've highlighted, and then you can edit it right in here, right? And propose basically a suggestion. And uh, this is not a commit or anything like that. Again, there we go. This is not a commit or anything like that. Right now, it's just markdown text. Um, does it work if you add single comment? Does it let you accept the suggestion?
yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, cool. So here is that most recent comment, but since I used that suggestion markdown thing, I get this new option to, well, I guess two related options, but I can just commit the suggestion right away, like I don't have to go and copy and paste what they typed into the thing. I can just accept their suggestion right away, which is really dope and also very handy for this kind of thing.
Also, before you hit that, right there where it's blinking, it has like update SRC content members core.
Right.
So that's the commit title. And
Yeah.
then the description, you could change that too. You could write, David Pumpkins obviously wanted a pumpkin. And then in the description, I humored him, and then write commit change. Um, or you can just leave it as is. Uh, yeah, any questions? So,
Uh, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Meg. Yeah. And this is another like really handy and useful feature in the GitHub UI. So well, I'm just going to go ahead and commit it. And so that just committed it there. I can see now I have 3 commits. It's the same pull request. I didn't have to do any, fancy stuff.
but
Um,
as the person that wrote the code, also, if you feel strongly like, no, I don't want the pumpkin, this is still just a suggestion. So
right,
you could write back, no, I really want the original emoji that I picked, and leave it. You don't have to commit what they suggested.
right.
Um,
Yeah, and it's threaded, right? So each like suggestion has its own little mini thread in the comments. So you can have a discussion just about this change right here, in this and sometimes those can get really involved if it's, I mean, there's a lot of different emojis to wait, I just chose, see, I didn't mean to choose pumpkin again. That's silly. But cool, another cool thing
it's
is
the
you can go,
jacket, it's taking you over.
I know, right? I'm just doing emoji. That's not helpful. Canoe. I love
Must pick pumpkins.
Um,
We have a question. Do the
yeah,
branch names follow a certain format?
that is a very good question. The answer is no, right? So branch names in like there is no universal law for branch names at all, right? They can really be any string that is not an existing branch name. Um, repositories or organizations, projects will have conventions, right, that they follow. And like in those cases, you want to try to follow what they suggest, So sometimes they're just like, just name it something that we can tell what's going on. Sometimes people are like, put your username first, or, they can get, sometimes there's a whole like bunch of code and stuff you have to put in them. Um, and those are it's convention versus any kind of universal law. So that's a good place, a good time when you're thinking about that sort of thing to go into whatever projects you're going to try to contribute to. Most of the time, they're going to have a contributing guide, which we do here in Virtual Coffee. And so let me see if we hopefully said something about branch names here. Uh, create a new branch. I think like, yeah, we just said you can be whatever you want. So like a virtual coffee, but like we do say here specifically, you can just name it what you want, right? And then yeah, in some cases they're going to be pretty specific about it. Um, and so you can kind of I would check out the contributing guide for if you're diving into a new project. And the answers there should be there. You probably can see here in my pull request, it says patch dash 3. So this was automatically generated when I went to change those when I created that, when I was like basically it said save changes. Um, and I think I had the option to rename it, at that time. So this is just what GitHub does. It says patch 3. Um, does that answer your question, Alex? Yeah, that's why you're seeing patch, is because the GitHub UI does that, kind of by default. So, and that's fine with us. Um, the pull request name I care about much more than the branch name. So most of the time, these branches are going to be coming from your forks and all that stuff. So there's not going to really be any conflicts. Um, and the pull request name is the thing that shows up when I look at like a list. If I'm scanning through the list, I see the pull request name or title or whatever you want to call it, not the branch name. So that's more important is do put something descriptive in the pull request name because when I'm looking at this list, I need to know what's happening. You know, doesn't have to be like a whole sentence or whatever, but something that at least describes at the very top level what the pull request is doing. Um, yeah, so hopefully that answers that question. It looks like our checks a yeah. So the Nullify build finished. So before I go into the maintainers view, and check this out. So you'll see this once it's done building. This isn't like a maintainer special thing. Everybody can see this. And if you, um, yeah, I think it just goes to view details. So this is going to go to this workflow and where is the redirect rules? Oh, maybe it's back in the main comments. Sorry. Hold on a second. Alex already has his pull request in, so that is perfect. Sorry, I'm trying to. Yeah, so if you go to this nullify comment and you can hit this, I know there's like just a link to go to the um, thing, and I think they changed how it looks. But if you go to this, the nullify comment, that should be like the first one it dumps in. There's this deploy log link. So you can go there, and then from here, you can do something.
I think it's under, is it under deploying?
Yeah, you would think so. Uh, sorry, I know it's somewhere. Hang on. Fine. All right, I haven't looked at this for a little bit, like what they put in their thing. So deploy. Where is like why would I be able to look at the this goes back to the pull request, right? All right. We can find it, you guys. I'm sure it's in here. So I'll check spam. Oh, deploy preview. There it is. All right, it's the one that says deploy preview. That was probably something I could have figured out, a lot quicker if I was paying more attention. But this is the deploy preview. So one thing to note on the deploy previews. Oh no, it came through good. All right, cool. So here is our new badge. It's a witch hat, which, it doesn't come through perfect because they're so tiny, but it is.
Adorable.
It is what it is. Um, witch hat, and then you can see my pumpkin emoji here. Because this was the change that I accepted. I haven't gone and accepted the canoe change back. So this was the most recent change. Um, once you have built it once, Netlify will keep a cache of the build, and so small tweaks, small changes will like rebuild a lot faster if you're working on pull requests that you want to see multiple changes on. But yeah, so looking at this, I can tell, hey, my emoji is showing up, my badge, my 2025 badge is showing up, and it looks pretty good. The images aren't showing up, and that's I think we have some notes in the README about this, but when you do a deploy preview, we have uh, the basically the since I'm logged in as not a maintainer, I don't give full access to the GitHub tokens that we have in the settings for everything. And so this is just pulling in some like very simple stuff and not pulling in the graphic because like to on production, um, we we what we do is when you add your member profile and your GitHub username, we are making GraphQL requests to the GitHub API and pulling a lot of this information down and filling this out, like all these things and stuff like that. So, and including the images, which is why that's the biggest thing that looks off is the images aren't there, and that's why. And so we're kind of filling it in with some fake data. There's a placeholder image here. That shows up in other places too, in deploy previews. I think if you look at the sponsors section. There's just like random ass whatever GitHub profiles generated. I don't know who this guy is, but like, um, and so you'll see other fake data in the deploy preview. And that's true if you run this locally as well. Although locally you can add, again, this is in our README, but you can add a GitHub token to your environment file locally, and you don't need to give it any permissions. It's just enough to get to basically to access the GitHub API. They need you to be logged in. So yeah, so that's looking good. Um, and this is a good thing like for contributors, but it's also, as a maintainer, if I'm going through on small pull requests, I'll open up the deploy preview and make sure it looks good most of the time instead of pulling the branch down myself and, rebuilding it locally. So we use that feature a lot.
Dan, real
Yeah.
quick, can you explain to everyone what it means to run it locally?
Yeah, so running it locally would be th that's like another option for making these changes. So this change, we did all this, the code change and the forking and all that stuff, and the branching on in the GitHub UI, which by that I mean the GitHub website. If you wanted to run changes on your own computer and see the code in VS Code on your own computer, things like that, um, we have like guides for that, but basically what that means is you would fork the repository to your local one. So, and GitHub has like big buttons to help you do that. And forking is a GitHub specific thing, not a Git or local development thing. Um, but then you would end up with a copy of this repository. So you can see here forked from virtual copy, right? You end up with a copy under your username. Of our entire repository, right? And so I'm trying to figure out what the highlights of this would be, but like basically you'd clone the GitHub repository down to your local computer, which means it would pull all of these files down to your local computer. And then you'd follow the instructions in our README to run the site on your local computer. And so what that means is a site running like on a local host domain. So it's not on virtualcoffee.io anymore. It's on localhost, and I actually have it running. I think I still have it running locally here. So I don't know if you can see that URL very well, but it is just localhost control colon 9000. And what that lets you do is make changes and see changes in real time without having to wait for the deploy preview and all that stuff, or before anybody else sees it at all. To get a deploy preview going, you have to submit a pull request, and so this is a way to see changes um, on your own computer without going through that process. And there's a lot of benefits. I would say if you're doing a more extensive issue or changes that will have, I don't know, that are harder, or like more involved, I think it's worth it. Our README is pretty solid, so if you are contributing to our repository, I would highly suggest taking a look at the README. We follow. There's steps for getting um, local development running, all that stuff. We should, and again, or as always, I would say, if you are following these steps and you run into some problems, our open source channel is a good place to go for that. If you notice things that are incorrect in the README, which happens from time to time, that is a very good case for making an issue, and you can even make the change as well. Um, Although, making an issue is a good first step. I think, so I mentioned, Dominic was asking about updating his profile. That's pretty much the only situation that I would not really like almost require an issue before you make your pull request. If you're updating your personal information, that's fine. Otherwise, if you notice a problem in the README and it still seems like a problem, go ahead and make an issue and say this, README needs to be updated. And if you make the issue and you want to do the change, we will let you do that. Like we'll let you do the change. That's no problem. So you don't have to worry about somebody else, snagging it from you. Um, I don't know, Meg and Becca both have your hands up. So you
Meg
guys,
was first.
I beat her. Yeah, what you said, Dan, if you notice something on the site or the repository that looks off that you think needs a change, definitely go ahead, open up an issue, and just reach out to myself, Becca, or IU. I'm not sure, Dominic, what your bandwidth is with this, but put it in the monthly challenge channel because that's all Hacktoberfest stuff. And if you want to work on it, we definitely will make sure like you get dibs on it since you found it. And if you just noticed it and you're like, hey, here's an issue for someone to work on for Hacktoberfest, that's great too. We definitely are looking for all the bugs and issues and new things we can find this month. And also, if it's something that could easily be broken down into smaller parts, keep that in mind as well, because we'll happily do that to maximize your number of pull requests. Go ahead, Becca.
And the other thing I want to say, if you are new to open source and you're going through this README and you're like, I have no idea what's going on or what this means, that's like a really great place to start because it's our goal to support everybody that's contributing. So if there's something that doesn't make sense, you're like, I have no idea what this is, then feel free to reach out to us. And like, I would be happy to walk you through how to create that issue and that PR because if you've never created an issue before, you might be like, I just don't know what to do or what to put. And that's totally okay. And so since we want to support everybody with these steps, there are things that we can do. We might not write it all out here in the README, but we can link to resources at least that can help you. And you could be the one that adds that resource. So for example, like in the README and the contributing docs and the code of conduct, I think those are all, are those markdown? Those are markdown files, right, Dan?
Yes, absolutely.
So, it's a bit different than having to know how to code with like HTML. It's a little bit more, I would say like a little less friction, more natural language. There's some things that you can use for styling if you haven't used Markdown before. Um, but in all, I think that it's something that I feel confident that you would be able to do with a little support. So this is here to say, if you don't understand, don't feel like that's on you. Feel like this is an opportunity for me to get a contribution in. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Jim.
a thousand
Oh,
percent.
sorry.
I was just gonna just real quick. I was gonna say 1,000% agree with all of that. Um, and yeah, if you have questions, I mean, it might be we might some of it might be just like helping walk through. Some of it might be like, yeah, we found out it really would be helpful if this was more clear. So please like reach out. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to confirm something that Meg was saying. So, am I understanding correctly? There's not a way to sort of self-assign an issue. We have to talk to a maintainer. Is that
That's
correct?
right. Yes, that's correct. And that's true in all of GitHub, across GitHub. You need to have certain permissions to be able to assign an issue. Is that right? Were you going to
It,
correct?
it depends. I know like when at OpenSauce, we
Well,
had
yeah,
a command where you would just write, I think, take, and then it would auto assign you. But if that's the case for a repository, then it probably will say that in the contributing docs. I think if IU is still
yeah.
here,
That
IU, I don't know if we have that in our on our repositories, but feel free to like,
Um,
yeah, dot take. Exactly. Thanks, Alex.
we don't, and like I wouldn't really want to on this repository. I think just because of especially Hacktoberfest and things like that, we sometimes make sure like we do some stuff to make sure everybody gets a fair amount of issues, things like that. But you can comment and say, I would really love to take this issue, and usually like I'd say 90% of the time that is good enough for one of us to just say, cool, go for it.
also,
But by default in GitHub, you can't assign labels, you can't assign issues, things like that, without at least the what is it, the what do you call it, the triage level of permissions, right? And the thing that Becca was talking about was is really cool, but it's a workflow. It's like a kind of a hack to get around that. And so it's a workflow that watches issue comments for that phrase or that code, and then it will assign the issue to the person that made that comment, which is it is a very cool feature, and comes in handy. But yeah, in general, by default, You can't self-assign issues or assign issues to anybody really, unless you have write access to the repository.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, like definitely for the month of October, like I personally um log on like 45 minutes early in the morning just to see, okay, what came through overnight and kind of knock out some stuff. Um, because there's just so much churn this month. And then if it's like worst case, I get started work early and then I get done early, you know? So the thing with, and also why we encourage people to sign up in our VChai initiative, where's the link there? Sorry, I'm looking for it. Is so we know which of our members are participating in Hacktoberfest, and um, we're able to like communicate more easily with all of you. And um, sorry, I'm trying to do this at the same time. Okay, we're able to communicate more easily with you and know like, okay, so Jim, he's going for all 6 this year, and he's got 2 weeks left and already got 4 in. So let's try to find him 2 more. Chris, he's just like, I don't care if I hit 6. I just want to participate. He's working on something right now, but about to wrap it up. So let's try to find something that's good for his stack, you know, kind of that thing. And it's even more convenient since we have Slack too to communicate in addition to GitHub. So
Yeah, thank you, man. Um, yeah, any other questions at this time? Um, so I was mentioning, yeah, I wanted to kind of, and this
and real
is just kind
quick,
of what's
I just want to jump in real quick.
mhm.
We have a question. If we're looking for mentors again, we're not doing mentor-mentee pairs this year, but we probably will be asking for volunteers. I think we talked about having some kind of office hour type thing in co-working room. Um, but we'll I don't know if Becca has more information. We will be looking for some volunteers still though.
Yeah, for sure. If there is a time that you say, hey, like I would love to help people in general with Hacktoberfest, or even I'm a maintainer and I'm happy to have hours where folks can come in and ask me questions, or if they need support, reach out to me and we can figure that out. We can get that set up. In a way that works for you. It doesn't have to be consistent. You don't have to do it every week. If you're like, hey, I've got an hour, I think it's even fine to go in the monthly challenge channel. If you're like, I have an unexpected extra hour because the meeting got canceled, I'm going to let folks know that if they have Hacktoberfest questions, I'm going to be in the co-working room. And that's in Slack. You go into the co-working channel and you can click the join button to be part of the co-working room. So it's open 24 hours a day. You can go in whenever you want. Just let people know if you're there to help with Hacktoberfest.
Yeah. Um, yeah, thank you. Um, so yeah, so this is kind of what this project looks like from the maintainer side of the view. So there's some extra tabs and everything up here. The pull request list, you know, looks the same, but when we and honestly, the pull request interface looks a lot the same as well. Just have a couple extra controls that you know you wouldn't have if you don't have write access to the repository, right? So if you remember, if we go back here and look at my pull request that I made, what? Oh no, yeah. So so this is something I do sometimes accidentally. So if you notice here, I hit pull request and it says I don't have any pull requests, and that is confusing, right? But the thing is that you can see here I am on my virtual coffee fork, and so when you fork a repository, you get the whole like deal. So pull requests. So people could submit pull requests to my fork instead of to the original one. Not a lot. Like there are some times where that's useful and people use it, but in general, look, that's not really what we want to do. So if you ever see that and you're like, why aren't there any issues or pull requests? You probably accidentally landed on your fork instead of wait a second. Oh yeah. So I'm signed in as Dan. Okay, yeah, cool. So here now we're back to the main repository, and we can check out my pull request on this side. So I just wanted to show you here. Since I am just a regular user, I can close my own pull request. That's always an option if you decide for whatever reason you want to do that. Or I can comment, and that's pretty much all I can do. And I can commit code to my own branch, things like that. If we look at this from the maintainer side, we have all the same comments. I can see the discussion that's happening about the the one line or whatever, and I can see here the emoji discussion. I also can commit this suggestion, even though somebody else made it. I can suggest a different suggestion, which is always option. And then here is my review requirements. So I can see here the automated checks have passed, but I can't merge this until a maintainer um, approves it. I do have this ability as like an admin to pass this, to skip this if I wanted to. I'm not going to do that, but my next step here is if I'm assigned to reviewing this issue, I'll do the things that we did before, which is like I will open the deploy preview. We already did that. I will, look at the code that's changed, and again, I can comment and all that stuff if I want. And then and so this is actually, I'll show you here the review situation. Um, and so I'm going to say I'm wearing the jacket and the tie. The pumpkin is staying. So we're going to stay with pumpkin and then I can resolve this conversation. So what that means is like, this just kind of goes away. You can always see it later and things like that. Um, and then what I can do again is if I have a comment here, are we sure we mean David? I can so before we hit add single comment here, I can start a review. And so if this was a user and I wanted to actually see some changes, what I've done now is started a review, and you can see this is pending. And I can do this a bunch of times if I have a bunch of comments in the code. I also can just like leave a big comment. I usually note, even though they show up, I say see inline comments, or I was like, we'd like to see some changes, something like this, right? And then my options are comment, which is just a comment, or I can approve it, or I can request changes. And so let's do that really quick just to see what this looks like. What just happened? I clicked off of it. So request changes, right? So I'm going to submit review and request the changes. And so here in this pull request, I still can't merge it because it hasn't gotten a review. If I go and I'll get it, my fake user would get an email, GitHub notification as well about this, and it would say requested changes now, right? And so I would like, oh man, this maintainer requested some changes, and I can go in here and say and look at the changes they asked for. I can, this is another place where you can accept those code suggestions that we show before, or go and commit some more code. Um, and if not, I'm going to say comment and resolve the conversation. Lots of times, once you get into this cycle, you can leave a comment. You can also, are you able to? Yeah, request a review. So here it says reviewers, and this Daniel Tiat is that's my like maintainer profile. So yeah, I can see here they requested changes. And once I've made the changes, or think I have, I can hit this button here and it says re-request review, which means now maintainer Dan has been notified that contributor Dan, made the changes, right? So come over here and see one pending review. And so I can kind of just do that again. It's all kind of contriving some changes, but I'm like, all right, cool. It looks good now. Looks good and approve, right? And then at this point, um, now I have a big green squash and merge button. Um, and I'm good to go, right? So in the maintainer view, well, let's look at what it looks like right now before we merge it. So here's the contributor view. Now it's been approved. Well, oh, and it just says I can't be the one that merges this. So like contributor Dan, there's no merge button, right? We already knew that. But maintainer Dan has the power. So I'm going to merge this in and then and that's it. So you can kind of, I don't think you see the deploy progress in here. So you just kind of have to wait for it to deploy. But I got a notification over here that said, hey, this is all merged in. And I can delete this branch. You can, there are settings in GitHub you can turn on, I'll show you that in a second, and I have it turned on pretty much everywhere where you can automatically delete merge pull request branches, which I find to be really handy because then the branches don't hang around forever because it's done. Um, if you don't have that turned on, you can just delete it in here. If you do want to turn that on, if you go to your, so this is in GitHub, your settings, and then I believe it's in something. Where is it? Super duper remember where it is. Repositories. Bye, Dominic.
What are we looking for?
The checkbox to automatically delete branches. It's in here somewhere. I know it's true on the organization level. Maybe it's not true on
Yeah,
maybe you can't do that at the user level.
I don't think, I don't know if there is one.
I might be lying about it being.
Chat, does anybody know? Chime in. I know there's a prune setting for Git, but
Yeah, I mean, there's all sort of stuff to manage that, but
we got Kirk is awesome in chat.
yeah, that's one of the organizations I believe that this account belongs to.
Oh,
Yeah.
why am I not in it? Oh, you know, it owns that org. The Kirk is awesome org.
Mhm. I'm a founding member.
Wow.
So in the organization, you can go into, I just did this. Where did they change where everything is?
Maybe.
Yeah, they do that sometimes. General. No,
It might be in rule sets.
it's it doesn't matter a lot, but I know it's in here somewhere. This is like the kind of thing I get stuck on, but
You know,
when you
you
can
can
find it
find it
later.
out and post it in
Yeah,
Slack.
we'll do that. So we can kind of skip this part. But it's just a setting that's just I find it to be handy. Because then your excuse me, repository doesn't show blow it up with a ton of branches that where the work is already complete. Joe, we're looking for the setting to automatically delete merged pull request branches.
Oh, if you go into the actual repo settings,
Oh, it's in the repo?
yeah.
Okay, so that would probably be on the fork. So we have that turned on the yeah, I thought it was on the organization. Where is,
That makes more sense.
yeah.
That's for repo.
Yeah. No, go back. So this is on my fork repo, right? settings, branches. Yeah, see, this is the, I knew there was a one called branches that I was looking for. Oh no, add rule set.
Go back to the general.
Yeah, it's in general. It's,
And I think if we scroll down a little bit,
good call.
um,
Pull requests.
and a little bit further down. There you go. Automatically delete head. Yep.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah, so that's all right. So it's per repository. I was thinking it's user organization, but it is per repository. But if you're doing a lot of these kinds of things, it might be handy to go in there and do that.
There's
Um,
the answer, everybody.
there's the answer. Thank you, Joe.
Per repository. Thank you, Joe.
So
OC.
it's just in settings in general. Yep. Um, and so I can go and take a look to see if the deploy finished. It is. So if we go to well, it's already loaded up. So if we refresh this page, hopefully we'll see. Yep, there's my pumpkin and there's my 2025 badge. So that is kind of it. Um, it does seem like, just as a weird note, it does seem like the language Hacktoberfest was using, they're going to try to, I don't know, they're like trying to raise the bar for everybody. And so I'm hoping this contribution will be meaningful enough that they'll accept it. If not, we'll try to, talk to them and work through it. If anybody has problems getting this accepted from Hacktoberfest, please let us know right away because they like to talk to maintainers. They're good about, I've had, a couple like just small issues come up in the past few years, and they've always been really responsive and things like that as a maintainer. So if you run into any problems or if it shows that it doesn't count towards your Hacktoberfest total on the hacktoberfest.com site, please just let us know right away because we can kind of dig in with that.
I think that was mainly there in the past have been things like add your name to this markdown list and you can get
Right.
counted towards Hacktoberfest pull request.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
So we're hoping these will be fine, but we'll see. And if it's wait, which order did these come in? We can kind of do these. Cool. Wait,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, can I talk a little bit
Yeah.
about, yeah, okay. So Becca mentioned it earlier. You can watch the action here, while I blab. Well, before I get into it, first off, thank you so much, Mr. Pumpkins, for
Come.
um your wonderful demonstration here. I mean, folks, come on. He had coffee wet pants and everything. And also another shout out goes to all these people who just had to leave to go live their busy lives. Becca, IU, Dominic, they did a lot of heavy lifting for Preptember, the month before this, and Hacktoberfest. Also, Chris Jarvis, who's still here, and Arvind and Leo, they're all part of the monthly challenge team, and what this is our biggest month, I think, as far as monthly challenges go. So you all rock. You're awesome, and thank you so much for volunteering and helping to get this going because it takes several people and lots of hours of work. So yeah, definitely it's extra upon what is all the normal things that keeps virtual coffee going. Oh my gosh. Sorry. Alex just put a corny joke in chat. So yeah, if you guys see these folks putting things in Slack, or you see them come into virtual coffee, Zoom meetings, or co-working room or whatever, just give them a shout and thank them for all they do. We certainly appreciate them as the maintainers. And yeah, so Becca mentioned it earlier. There are definitely more ways to contribute than code. There's, you can, anytime you'd like, update your members page. But the things we have in here, there's a lot of it is markdown files, which is pretty much plain text with some rule sets. The rule sets are very easy to follow. And if you see things like spelling mistakes, things that are just out of date because that happens and weren't caught, and you're like, oh, hey, this needs to be updated. Those are very easy. What do they call those? Low-hanging fruit that you can just pick off and get a pull request in. And it's not like, oh yeah, I just found a broken link, or I just found a typo and fixed it. Like, those aren't any less important than changing code, because it takes all different types to keep a code base going. Something that is definitely overlooked by a lot of people during events like this are testing, project management, and design. So if you're interested in anything like that, and documentation, we luckily have a lot of good documentation. Not saying we don't need any help with that. We won't turn anybody away who wants to help. But if you're interested in any of those things and you think of a way that you can contribute, like if it's not explicitly written up, that's okay. Come to me, Becca, IU, and come with your idea and say, what do you think? And we'll talk with you and figure out a way to make it work and to make it count towards Hacktoberfest. For instance, I know I think it was it Aaron or uh, Ross, I think. Ross said someone had added, he accepted a pull request for new issue templates. So someone added issue templates to his repository. So now when people open up issues on his project, there's a template there to make it easier. That's a YAML file. So that's a lot like Markdown. And what was it? I think it was 2 years ago. Leo, he is more in the design area. He did a kind of design overview of the Ruby for Good site that I maintain and put his findings. He just kind of wrote them down in Markdown. And all I did was I opened an issue on the Ruby for Good site and wrote something up, like, I'm looking for someone to do a design audit for the site, and assigned it to him. and his commit was adding that file with all his findings. So that's how we did it. He still used his design skills and just kind of wrote out that content. And the year before that, Taiwo had contributed by building a GitHub action. He built an action to lint the code when people sent in a pull request. So I made that an issue. I said, add a GitHub action. And then when he did it, I think there's a little bit of code in there that is added to the code base, but it counted towards that. So it doesn't have, it's like Taiwo doesn't know Ruby, but he was able to contribute to Ruby for good. So there's like, I'm just kind of saying, don't count things out. That's the great thing about having this community and being able to talk with people directly. If you're looking to do things, just ask, and people will be able to find issues for you and meet you kind of where you're at.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Meg. There's I I don't know, 1,000% agree with everything you said. And the Hacktoberfest site has some resources for in the participation tab, resources for beginners, which is really good, and a whole section about lower no non-code contributions. Really cool too. So the Hacktoberfest.com site has a lot of cool resources to look at as well for all that stuff. Just to like add on to what everything Meg was saying. Yeah, does anybody else have any questions or comments, concerns, anything like that? I think we've made it through our, when Alex is saying there's a DigitalOcean Discord that has a Hacktoberfest section. So that'd probably be kind of fun to jump into as well, if you're into that sort of thing. But I mean, I think I've reached the end of my content for this little kickoff. So if anybody else has any thoughts or anything they want to talk about, we can meet up in the open source room. I'll probably try to dip in and out of the co-working room over the month, although not so much today. I have a busy day ahead of me as well. But we'll keep an eye on the pull requests coming in for the site. I have some plans for some issues to add as well, so I will probably drop that in the. Usually I drop it in the open source room. I guess for this month I'll probably drop it in the um, monthly challenge room as I add new issues to the site that are open for people to work on. So, and if anybody sees organizations that or repositories projects that look cool that have a lot of available issues, I mean, sharing those is going to be really cool and helpful for other people. Or if anybody especially has projects that they help maintain themselves, please let us know about those as well, because we like to, support our friends when we can.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I dropped in the chat a link to the monthly challenge page on our site that has a lot of resources too. And also a member in chat said they forget every year how to search GitHub for repositories. I put a link this is actually from the Hacktoberfest page. It's like the Hacktoberfest topic search on GitHub, and like the GitHub search is pretty advanced. If you go on GitHub and type / the search bar comes up, and at the bottom of the search bar there's this like, oh wait, here it is. I'm gonna just put it here. There's a link that has the search syntax tips, and I put the documentation there.
Yeah.
You can search by language and add a tag in there as well. And like you can get very granular with it.
Yeah. The search UI is also really good. So if you forget or want to skip that and you just put what you're typing, what you're searching for in the search bar and hit enter, you'll land on a page like this. And then you can filter down. So sometimes I go into GitHub because Google doesn't always index. I mean, I know they try to, but they're sometimes behind as far as indexing the contents of issues. And so um, sometimes if I'm trying to figure out what's going on, like I can't get something to work or whatever, I'll come into GitHub and then go into like do my search query, whatever it is, usually some error message or something, and then go into the issue search. But you can, so here I just typed in Hacktoberfest. And so their first one is repositories. And so this is like any repository I think that has Hacktoberfest probably in its name. But down here is topics. And so this is like all the different topics. The first one is that Hacktoberfest topic. And that was the link that Meg posted earlier. And a topic in GitHub is on something you add to a repository. And so that's this list of like things here. They're like tags kind of, and all repositories have them. Some of them, or maybe they don't all have one, I suppose. I think when you create a repository, you are asked for topics. You can skip it, so they might just be empty. But this is like high level tags, if you're looking for, let me go back to here. So if you're looking for that search tool or the search syntax link that Meg posted is pretty cool because you can actually, to combine searches, you have to do that. So you can do topic : Hacktoberfest and then language. Is that it? I
Ruby.
think Ruby. And so
What?
here it showed 0 results for topics because I was still on topics, but I can go into issues and or I can go into repositories. So this will show me any Ruby repository, any repository that use the Ruby that has the Hacktoberfest, tag. You can also go into issues and you can say is open. You can say is unassigned. I could type. I think that those are the right. Nope, that's not it. Let me get so another thing I do when I forget the syntax instead of like looking at the thing is if you go to a repository and go to issues, they have these like filter buttons, state open, right? And you can filter using their UI, but it also puts the syntax into the search bar. So here I'm going to go to assignees and say no assignees. And so I'm going to copy and paste. So this is in Virtual Coffee. This says open issues that are not assigned, right? Issue open, not assigned. And I'm going to copy this into that search result that I was doing before. So I messed up a couple of these. But so we're going to keep topic, Hacktoberfest, language, Ruby. And then I'm saying, give me all issues that are Ruby in a Hacktoberfest repo that are open and not assigned.
You're so
And
smart,
there's
David.
907,000, issues there. And, some of these are junk. Some of these are cool. Not all. This doesn't guarantee that the issue will be specifically about Ruby, right? So like repositories can have multiple languages, I mean, ours does, and so it's not like a solve all, there's probably more filters you can add to try to like narrow it down if you want. But it's kind of a fun way to do this. And you can sort by a best match. You can sort by the oldest issue all right, so what's the oldest issue that matches this query? Was opened in 2009.
99.
Yeah, it was opened on March 17th. Add markdown support. Come on. So like this is like somebody's probably just like somebody's
Ain't
random
a blog.
project that like, like this search result thing doesn't do any, checking on the quality of the issue or the quality of the repository or any of that.
Because they're starting to get whack.
Mm.
Get the regexes under control.
Yes. Right. I mean, this is a big problem to have. If your regex gets whack, that's a
Yeah,
so. Wait, did you say regex or did you say regex?
I said regex.
All right, who says regex and who says regex?
I use them interchangeably just
I
to.
kind of do too. I don't have a strong opinion about this one, but it always like I honestly have read it obviously way more than I've said it out loud. Reg makes more sense. So if I'm gonna be
E as in garage.
well, G as in regular, right? That's what I mean. Like the regular domain, right? That doesn't matter. We don't need to get super sidetracked, but yeah, Meg said at the beginning of the search is very it can be advanced, is very powerful, their GitHub search. So you can do a lot of cool stuff.
I said that, but like I don't use it like this. He is a power user. I'm just like, it can be power. Like I've heard it can be.
I've heard tell. Um, but that Hacktoberfest topic, I believe they are well, let's just go back to the link that Meg posted. So this is like something GitHub chose to add this. So like we already know that they're keeping some kind of eye on this, you know? But yeah, like right here, I can go JavaScript. I can just type that. And this will, oh yeah, it's not showing the search, but this matches, you know, language, JavaScript.
Drop
It's
down.
sorting by most stars, you know, which like could be a way to go or also could be not a way to go, you know, like lots and lots of stars means lots of attention, which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's neat.
So much, Dan.
Yeah, see, all right. So Joe says the portmanteau redefines the pronunciation, which like,
Let's end
except
on
that
this
this gives
and
us a
not
problem with Giphy.
on portmanteaus.
Um,
So
Hacktoberfest. Yay.
Hacktoberfest, yes. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you everybody. Meg, thank you for you know, your help running this little what do you call it?
We'll just
Kickoff event.
stop the recording.
Bye everyone.